The alarm did not sound like danger. It sounded like the end of something. I was standing on the observation deck of Outpost Verkala when the light above the door turned red and every voice in the room dropped to a whisper at the exact same moment. I remember that detail clearly because it was strange. Alarms usually make people shout. This one made everyone go quiet. I am Lyra Venn, and at that time I was a junior officer of the Kaith Border Watch, 3 years into my service, still young enough to believe that fear was something other people felt. My commanding officer, an older Kaith named Doran Ash, stood frozen at the sensor console with his hand pressed flat against the glass, as if he could stop the reading on the screen just by touching it. "Confirm the signature," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. The technician beside him, a young woman named Petra Dell, ran the scan twice. Her hands were shaking. "Confirmed. Single vessel. Design does not match any registered fleet in this sector." "Ask again," Doran said. "Ask it properly this time." Petra looked at him like he had lost his mind, but she typed the command anyway. The console blinked, searched, and returned the same 3 words it had returned before. Unknown, human, unregistered. I did not understand why that word alone could empty a room of color, but I watched it happen. Doran's face lost whatever warmth it had held a moment earlier. An older engineer, near the back of the deck, actually stepped away from his station, as if putting distance between himself and a screen could protect him from what it was telling him. Someone near the door said a name. I did not catch it clearly, only a fragment of sound, low and fast, gone before I could ask them to repeat it. But I saw what it did. Petra's hands stopped shaking and went completely still, the way a small animal goes still when it hears something large moving through tall grass. "That is not possible," Doran said, mostly to himself. "That name has not been spoken on this station in 11 years. I had heard it before, that name, though I had never known it belonged to an actual person. It was the kind of word Kaith parents used the way parents everywhere use certain words. To make children behave, to make them go to sleep without arguing, to make them stop wandering toward the edge of a platform or the open door of an airlock. Behave, or he will come. I had always assumed it meant nothing. A sound with no face behind it, built from old fear and older stories, the way every culture keeps a few words in reserve for the dark. I opened my mouth to ask what was happening, but Doran raised his hand, and the whole deck fell silent again, waiting. The unknown vessel drifted closer on the display, a small blinking shape against the black. My pulse was quick, though I told myself it was only the excitement of witnessing my first real alert. I told myself the older officers were reacting to policy, not to feeling. I told myself a great many things in those few minutes, and every one of them turned out to be wrong. "Bring up full defensive protocol," Doran said. "Quietly. No panic. Everyone to stations." "Sir, it is a single ship," Petra said. "Our defenses could handle 10 of these." Doran turned to her, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his eyes that I can only describe as old grief wearing the mask of caution. "It only takes one," he said. I did not understand the weight behind those words yet. I would understand it later, in pieces, the way you understand a wound only after the shock wears off and the pain finally arrives. We waited. The ship did not fire. It did not accelerate. It simply held position at the edge of our scanning range, quiet and patient, like something that already knew exactly how much fear its presence alone could cause without ever needing to act. After 11 long minutes, a signal arrived, not a threat, not a demand, a simple, almost polite request for docking clearance, sent in careful, formal Kaith, apologizing for the delay in identifying itself and explaining that its long-range transmitter had failed 3 days earlier. It was a merchant vessel. A single trader, off course, running old civilian hardware that our systems had never been updated to recognize. That was all. No weapon, no war, no monster in the dark. And still, no one on that deck relaxed. Not fully. Not even after the ship docked, unloaded a cargo of harmless machine parts, and departed 6 hours later without incident. I remember standing beside Doran as the ship pulled away, watching him exhale like a man setting down something heavy he had been carrying for a very long time. "Sir," I said carefully, "why did everyone react the way they did? It was only a merchant ship." He was quiet for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual authority in it. It sounded almost like a confession. "Because for one moment, Lyra, we believed the word on that screen might mean something else," he said. "And there are very few things in this galaxy that can make grown officers forget their training in a single breath. That word is one of them." "What actually happened?" I asked. "The stories we were told as children, was any of it real?" Doran looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look an adult gives a child when they are deciding how much truth that child can carry. "I do not know all of it," he said finally. "No one alive on this station does. Not truly. We only know the ending, and even that we know second-hand, passed down until the edges have worn smooth. But I will tell you this much. Whatever that name means to us, it was born from something real, something none of us witnessed, and all of us still fear." I laughed, though not unkindly, still young enough in my service to believe fear like that belonged only in stories meant to frighten hatchlings before sleep. "It sounds like something meant to keep children quiet," I said. Doran did not laugh with me. "It was meant to keep children alive," he said. "There is a difference. I hope you never learn it the way we did." I did not think about that conversation again for almost 2 years. I filed it away, the way you file away most things said by older officers who have seen more than you. Polite respect, layered over quiet disbelief. I had scans to run, reports to file, a career to build. The name faded into the background noise of my life, another old story from a species that had survived enough trauma to build entire traditions out of caution. I was wrong to dismiss it. I understand that now. Because 2 years later, my superiors called me into an office I had never been invited into before, told me I had been selected for a diplomatic posting of significant importance, and informed me, almost as an afterthought, that the treaty renewal I would be attending included a delegation from a species we had not formally negotiated with in generations. Humans. I remember the exact sensation in my chest when I heard that word spoken aloud in an official context for the first time. No longer a children's story, no longer a blinking word on a screen belonging to a lost merchant ship, but a real diplomatic fact written into real orders with my real name attached to them. I told myself it was simply nerves about a new assignment. I told myself the old stories were exactly that, old, and that I was too well trained, too rational, too modern to let inherited fear shape my judgment before I had even met a single member of that species. I did not yet know how wrong I was to be so certain. I did not yet know that somewhere in the files waiting for me on that station, buried under years of careful redaction, was the answer to a question I had never thought seriously enough to ask as a child, whispered in the dark by parents who themselves had never fully understood it. Who was he? And why, after everything, did an entire galaxy still lower its voice when it said his name? The orders arrived on a small data pad, and I read them 3 times before I believed what they said. I had been assigned to Station Meridian Hold, a neutral outpost built generations ago specifically for negotiations between species that did not trust each other enough to meet on their own territory. My task was simple in theory. Serve as junior attaché to the senior Kaith delegation during the renewal of the Ashen Accord, a treaty that kept 3 border regions from sliding back into open conflict. I had trained for exactly this kind of work. I had studied trade law, translation protocol, the careful choreography of formal diplomacy. None of my training had prepared me for the reaction of my own colleagues when they learned who else would be sitting at that table. "You volunteered for this?" asked Corin Vale, a fellow attaché I had known since training academy, when I told him my assignment over a shared meal the night before departure. "I did not volunteer," I said. I was selected. Then someone dislikes you, he said, only half joking. I laughed it off at the time, though the joke stayed with me longer than I expected. Over the following days, as word spread among the junior staff that human delegates would be present at Meridian Hold for the first time in longer than any of us had been alive, I began to notice a pattern I had first seen on that observation deck 2 years earlier. Grown officers, experienced negotiators, people who had faced down hostile fleets and furious trade disputes without flinching, all reacted the same way when the topic came up. A pause, a change in posture, a quiet unwillingness to discuss it further. 3 senior officers requested reassignment rather than attend. I found this almost funny, in a bitter sort of way. These were Kaith, who had served through actual border skirmishes, who had negotiated with pirate consortiums and hostile mining cartels without losing composure, and yet the mere presence of a human delegation on the guest manifest was enough to make them ask for a transfer. I decided, quietly, and perhaps a little arrogantly, that I would not be like them. I told myself that fear, built on second-hand stories, was not a form of wisdom. It was simply fear, dressed up in the language of caution, so that no one had to admit how irrational it actually was. I was proud of that thought. I held on to it the way you hold on to a belief you have not yet been forced to test. The night before I left for Meridian Hold, Doran Ash came to see me. I had not spoken to him since my transfer away from the border outpost, and I was surprised to find him waiting outside my quarters, older than I remembered, a little more tired around the eyes. "I heard about your assignment," he said, without any greeting first. "I assumed you would," I said. "News travels quickly among people who used to work together." He did not smile at that. He simply looked at me for a long moment, the same way he had looked at me on the observation deck 2 years earlier, deciding how much truth I could carry. "I am not here to tell you not to go," he said. "You could not refuse this posting even if you wanted to, and refusing it would only harm your career for no good reason. I am here to tell you something else." "Then tell me," I said. "Listen more than you speak while you are there," he said. "Read everything you are given access to, even the parts that seem irrelevant. And if you ever hear his name spoken aloud in that room, watch the reaction of everyone around you before you decide what to think about it yourself." "You still will not tell me what actually happened," I said. It was not quite an accusation, though it came close. "I have told you what I know," he said, "which is less than you think, and more than I wish it were. The rest is not mine to give you. It belongs to people who were there, and to whatever remains of the truth in the records at Meridian Hold, if the records have not been sealed too tightly for even a diplomat to reach." He left after that, without another word, and I stood in the corridor for a long time afterward, turning his warning over in my mind, trying to decide whether it was wisdom or simply another layer of the same inherited fear I had already decided to reject. I arrived at Meridian Hold 2 days later. The station was larger than I expected, a slow, rotating ring of neutral ground built and maintained by a rotating council of species who had long ago agreed that peace required a place belonging to no one and everyone at once. Docking control was calm and professional. The corridors were clean, well lit, filled with delegates and staff from a dozen different worlds moving briskly between meeting chambers. It did not feel like a place built on fear. It felt, for the first hour, exactly like what it was meant to be: ordinary, functional, safe. That impression did not survive the day. I was assigned quarters near the central diplomatic wing, and my first task was to review the full guest manifest with my senior officer, an experienced negotiator named Halvor Rees, who had handled treaty work for over 20 years. Halvor was sharp, efficient, and entirely unsentimental about protocol, which was why his reaction surprised me so much. We were going line by line through the confirmed delegations when he reached the entry for the human envoy and stopped scrolling. He did not say anything at first. He simply sat very still, staring at the screen, his jaw tight. "Is something wrong with the entry?" I asked. "No," he said, too quickly. Nothing is wrong with the entry. He resumed scrolling, but I noticed he skipped the rest of the human delegation's individual profiles entirely, moving straight to the next section of the manifest, as though the names beneath that heading did not exist. "Sir," I said carefully, "should I be reviewing their individual files as well?" "You will meet them in person soon enough," he said. "There is no need to read ahead." It was such an unusual answer from a man normally obsessed with preparation that I could not let it go. That evening, once my duties for the day were finished, I returned to the records office alone and requested access to the archived files related to previous human contact, the kind of background material any competent attaché would want before facing an unfamiliar delegation. The system returned an error I had never encountered before. Access restricted, clearance level insufficient. I tried again, adjusting my search terms, thinking perhaps I had simply misfiled the request. The same message appeared. I checked the General Historical Archive next, curious whether public record would offer anything at all, and found something almost stranger than a locked door. I found gaps. Entire sections of shared galactic history involving human contact had summaries only a few lines long, followed by notations that the detailed records had been sealed by mutual agreement between multiple governments, including my own. Mutual agreement. Multiple governments. Sealed. I sat in that quiet records office for a long time, staring at the blank space where history should have been. And I thought about what Doran had told me 2 years earlier. Whatever that name means to us, it was born from something real. I did not sleep well that night. The following morning, I met Bree Calder, a young logistics officer from a neutral station crew who had worked at Meridian Hold for nearly a decade and had seen more diplomatic gatherings than most attaches twice her age. She had a warm, practical manner that I liked immediately, and over breakfast in the staff commissary, I found myself telling her, carefully and without too much detail, about the strange gaps in the archive. She did not seem surprised. "Every species that has had contact with them keeps something sealed," she said, stirring her drink absently. "I have worked here 9 years. I have seen at least 6 different delegations react the exact same way whenever human representatives are mentioned on an agenda. Keith included, no offense." "None taken," I said. "I am beginning to understand why. The strange part," she continued, lowering her voice slightly, "is that it is never the same story twice. Ask a Keith elder what happened, and you get one kind of silence. Ask someone from the Orn Collective, and you get a completely different kind of silence. Different species, different border regions, different decades even, and yet somehow they all end up afraid of the same handful of names." "How many names?" I asked. She thought about it for a moment. "I have heard 3. Over the years, different species pronounce them differently, but I suspect they refer to the same very small number of individuals. One name comes up more than the others." My stomach tightened before she even said it, as though some older, quieter part of me already knew what she was about to tell me. "I do not know if I should say it out loud in a commissary," she said, half joking, though her eyes were serious. "Say it," I told her. She leaned in slightly and spoke the name, low and quick, the same way it had been spoken on that observation deck 2 years earlier, the same way Keith parents had spoken it to frighten children into obedience for longer than I had been alive. I felt the hair along my arms rise, an old instinctive reaction I could not explain through logic alone. "That is the name," I said quietly. "The one from my own species' stories." Bree nodded slowly. "It seems to travel further than anyone realizes. I used to think it was just a Keith thing. Then I heard an Orn diplomat use almost the exact same phrase to threaten her own child into behaving on a shuttle 3 years ago. I have wondered ever since whether it means the same thing to everyone who says it, or whether every species simply borrowed a fear that started somewhere else entirely." "Started where?" I asked. She shrugged, though the gesture seemed heavier than a simple shrug should be. "That is the part nobody seems willing to answer. Every thread leads back to a handful of years, a handful of border conflicts, and then it stops, like walking down a corridor that simply ends in a wall with no door. I thought about Halvor skipping past the human delegation's files without a word. I thought about the 3 senior officers who had requested reassignment rather than attend this posting. I thought about Doran's warning: watch the reaction of everyone around you before you decide what to think about it yourself, and I understood, finally, that I had walked into something far larger and far older than a single treaty renewal. That afternoon, the full guest schedule was posted publicly on the station's central board, listing arrival times for every delegation attending the Ashen Accord renewal. I stood in front of that board, with Bree beside me, scanning the names, mostly unfamiliar, mostly unremarkable, until my eyes reached the human delegation's arrival slot. 6 names were listed beneath it. 5 of them meant nothing to me at all. The 6th was accompanied by a small formal title I did not recognize: Senior Advisor, listed last, as though whoever had built the schedule wanted that particular name to be the final thing anyone read. I did not recognize the name printed there. It was ordinary, simple, the kind of name that could belong to anyone. And yet, standing there in front of that board, I felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the station's climate controls, an instinct older than reason, telling me, quietly and insistently, that whatever I was about to walk into, it was not going to be the ordinary treaty renewal I had been trained for. Bree must have noticed my expression, because she touched my arm gently. "You should get some rest before tomorrow," she said. "Whatever this is, you will want a clear head for it." I nodded, though I did not sleep that night either. I lay awake instead, staring at the ceiling of my quarters, turning over every fragment I had gathered so far: the redacted archives, the frightened senior officers, the strange name that seemed to cross species and decades and borders without losing its power to silence a room. I did not yet know that within 2 days I would be standing close enough to that name to hear it spoken, not as a threat, not as a story, but as a simple, quiet introduction. I did not yet know how completely it would change what I believed about fear, about history, and about the species I had spent my entire life believing I understood better than I actually did. I spent the following day trying to behave like a professional attaché instead of someone chasing ghosts through old records, but I did not succeed for very long. The morning was filled with the ordinary business of treaty preparation, seating arrangements, translation checks, verifying that every delegation's dietary and environmental needs had been properly logged with station support staff. It was tedious work, and normally I would have found comfort in its simplicity. That day, every task felt like a thin layer stretched over something enormous moving beneath it, and I could not stop thinking about the name Bree had spoken so quietly over breakfast. During a break between meetings, I found myself walking the diplomatic wing alone, past meeting rooms belonging to delegations from a dozen different worlds, and I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. Outside one of the smaller conference rooms, a group of delegates from the Orn Collective stood in a tight cluster, speaking in low voices, their body language tense in a way that seemed out of proportion to a simple treaty renewal. I recognized one of them, an older Orn diplomat named Celis Caro, from a border trade summit I had attended 2 years earlier. She had been calm and unshakable then, famous among junior staff for negotiating an entire fishing rights dispute without raising her voice once. The woman standing outside that conference room barely resembled the one I remembered. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, and she kept glancing toward the far end of the corridor, the direction from which the human delegation was scheduled to arrive. I approached carefully, introducing myself with the proper formal greeting, and asked if she had a moment to speak. She studied me for a long moment before nodding, though her eyes stayed wary. "You are Kaeth," she said, "attached to the Border Accord delegation." "I am," I said. "I noticed your delegation seemed concerned about something. I wondered if it was connected to logistics I might be able to help resolve." She almost smiled at that, though there was no real warmth in it. It is not a logistics problem, young one. It is an older kind of problem entirely. May I ask what kind? She glanced once more toward the far end of the corridor before answering, lowering her voice the way Bree had lowered hers in the commissary. My grandmother served during the last major conflict between the Orn Collective and several rival territories. She rarely spoke about those years. But there was one story she told more than once, always late at night, always in a voice barely above a whisper, about a human who arrived during the worst of the fighting and ended it in a single day, in a way she said she still could not fully explain, even decades later. My chest tightened. Ended it how? Celis shook her head slowly. She never gave details. She said only that she had seen things that day she wished she could remove from her memory entirely, and that whenever she thought she might finally understand what had happened, the fear returned stronger than the understanding ever could. "Do you know his name?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. Celis studied me carefully before answering, as though deciding whether I deserved to hear it confirmed. "The same name every species along that border learned to whisper afterward," she said. "The very same one I suspect you are asking about. Attaché." She did not say it aloud, not there in the open corridor, but I did not need her to. The confirmation alone was enough to settle something cold and certain in my stomach. I thanked her and continued down the corridor, my mind working faster than my steps, trying to organize the pieces I had gathered so far. A Kaith border conflict, an Orn Collective border conflict, different decades, different regions, and yet the same names surfacing each time, always connected to a single overwhelming event that no one who witnessed it seemed able or willing to fully describe. That afternoon, I requested a meeting with the station's chief archivist, an elderly official from a neutral species called the Verith, who had overseen Meridian Hold's records for longer than most attaches had been alive. His name was Corin Bassett, and he greeted me with the patient, slightly weary courtesy of someone who had answered 1,000 similar requests before mine. "I would like access to historical records concerning early human contact along contested border regions," I said, keeping my tone as professional and unremarkable as I could manage, "for treaty preparation purposes." Corin studied me over the rim of his reading glasses for a long moment before responding. "That request comes across my desk more often than you might expect, Attaché Ven. Usually from young officers who believe they are the first to think of asking." "I assume that means the answer is no," I said. "The answer is complicated," he said. "Full unredacted records from that period are sealed under a joint agreement between several governments, Kaith included, and I do not have authority to override that seal for a junior attaché, however good her intentions." "Is there anything you can share?" I asked. "Even summaries, even fragments?" He was quiet for a moment, and I sensed him weighing something internally, some old professional instinct, arguing with a more personal one. "I can show you the same summary fragments available in the General Historical Archive," he said finally. "Nothing beyond that. But I will tell you something the fragments will not, because I think you deserve at least that much honesty before you walk into a room with people who lived through what those fragments only hint at." "Please," I said. "The seal on those records was not requested by any single fearful government trying to hide something shameful," he said. "It was requested jointly by nearly every species who had contact with humanity during that period, including humanity itself. That is unusual, attaché. Governments rarely agree on anything, and they agree even less often on what should be hidden from their own people. When that many parties agree to seal something together, it typically means one of two things. Either the truth is so damaging that everyone involved wishes to avoid responsibility for it, or the truth is so overwhelming that no single government believed its own citizens were prepared to process it without unraveling something important about how they saw themselves." "Which do you believe it is?" I asked. Corin removed his glasses slowly and rubbed at the bridge of his nose, an old, tired gesture. "I have worked in this archive for 43 years, attaché. I have read every fragment permitted to remain in general circulation, cross-referenced against a dozen other partial accounts, smuggled out through unofficial channels over the decades. My honest belief, for whatever it is worth, is the second explanation. I do not believe humanity acted with cruelty during those years. I believe humanity acted with a kind of desperate, overwhelming necessity that terrified everyone who witnessed it, precisely because it worked exactly as intended. I sat with that for a long moment, turning the words over carefully. What worked exactly as intended? That, Corin said, sliding a small data file across the desk toward me, is a question I cannot answer fully, but I can give you what remains of the fragments. Read them carefully, attaché Venn, and remember that fragments, by their nature, are incomplete. Do not build your entire understanding on pieces that were never meant to stand alone. I took the file back to my quarters that evening and read through the night. The fragments were exactly that, broken pieces of a larger record, names redacted, locations generalized, timelines vague. But even in their incomplete form, a pattern began to emerge that made my skin feel cold despite the station's careful climate control. 3 separate border conflicts across 3 separate decades, involving 3 entirely different species, each one escalating toward what the fragments described only as total and irreversible loss. In each case, a single human envoy arrived, alone or nearly alone, during what the records called the final hours before collapse. And in each case, within a matter of days, the conflict ended, not through negotiation, not through gradual de-escalation, but through something the fragments consistently refused to name directly, referring to it only as the intervention. I read that word over and over throughout the night. The intervention, never described, never explained, only its aftermath recorded, carefully and clinically, as though whoever had compiled these fragments had deliberately chosen to document the outcome while refusing to document the method. In every single case, the fragments noted the same detail immediately following the intervention. The human envoy involved requested no recognition, accepted no honors, and in 2 of the 3 cases, departed the region entirely before formal ceremonies could even be arranged in their honor. One fragment, the most complete of the 3, included a partial quote attributed to an unnamed Caith commander from that period, preserved apparently because it had been spoken publicly enough that full redaction proved impossible. "I do not know what I witnessed today," the quote read. "I only know that I am alive to describe not knowing it, and that the man responsible walked away from what he did as though it had cost him something none of us will ever be permitted to understand." I set the data file down and sat very still in the quiet of my quarters, listening to the low hum of the station around me, feeling something shift inside my understanding of my own species' history, something I could not yet name, but could already feel reorganizing itself into a shape I had never considered before. I thought of Doran's warning on that observation deck 2 years earlier. It only takes one. I thought of the elders who had used that name to frighten children into staying close, into obeying, into never wandering too far from safety. I had always assumed that fear was built from ignorance, the kind of superstition species cling to when they do not understand something dangerous. Sitting there with the fragments spread across my desk, I began to suspect something far more unsettling. Perhaps the fear was not built from ignorance at all. Perhaps it was built from precise, painful understanding, passed down carefully enough that even generations later, no one needed the full details to know exactly how much respect that name deserved. The next morning, I returned to Bree Calder during a quiet stretch in the logistics office and told her, carefully and in general terms, what I had found. She listened, without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every sentence. 3 separate conflicts, she said finally. 3 separate species, and every time, the same outcome. The threat ends, and the person responsible disappears before anyone can properly acknowledge what he did. That is what the fragments suggest, I said. That does not sound like the story I grew up fearing, she said slowly. I always assumed, without really thinking about it, that the fear came from something humanity did to us, something taken, something destroyed. I assumed the same thing, I said. I am no longer certain that assumption was correct. Bree was quiet for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. If I am understanding you correctly, she said eventually, you are suggesting that an entire galaxy has spent generations whispering a name in terror, not because that person harmed us, but because of what he was willing to do in order to make sure we survived long enough to keep whispering anything at all. I did not answer immediately, because I did not yet have an answer I fully trusted, but something in her question settled into place alongside everything else I had gathered that week: the redacted archives, the frightened senior officers, Celis Caro's unfinished story about her grandmother, Corin Bassett's careful, weary honesty. I do not know yet, I said finally, but I intend to find out. Tomorrow, the human delegation arrives, and somewhere among them, according to the schedule, is the man whose name I have been hearing whispered since before I could properly speak. Bree reached over and squeezed my hand briefly, an oddly comforting gesture from someone I had known for only a few days. Then I hope, for your sake, attaché Ven, she said quietly, that whatever you learn tomorrow is easier to carry than what you have already learned tonight. I did not sleep again that night, not from excitement this time, but from something closer to dread mixed uneasily with anticipation, the strange sensation of standing at the edge of an answer I had spent my entire life avoiding without ever realizing it. Tomorrow, the delegation would arrive. Tomorrow, I would finally learn whether the man behind the whispers was the monster my childhood stories had always implied, or something far more complicated and far harder to simply fear. The human delegation was scheduled to arrive at midday, and by the time the hour approached, the main receiving hall of Meridian Hold had filled with more delegates than I had seen gathered in one place since my arrival. I stood near the front of the assembled crowd beside Halvor Reese, who had said very little to me since our conversation over the manifest days earlier. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, and I noticed he kept glancing toward the docking corridor entrance with an expression I recognized now, having seen it on so many faces over the past several days. It was not simple professional attentiveness. It was the careful stillness of someone preparing themselves to face something they had spent a long time avoiding. Around us, delegates from a dozen species stood in similarly tense silence. I noticed Celis Caro near the Orn Collective delegation, her hands folded tightly in front of her, exactly as they had been outside the conference room days earlier. Even the neutral station staff, people who saw diplomatic arrivals on a near-constant basis, seemed to have gathered in greater numbers than usual, drawn by something beyond simple curiosity. The doors at the far end of the receiving hall opened precisely on schedule, and the human delegation entered. I do not know exactly what I expected. Perhaps some part of me, despite everything I had read and heard over the previous days, still carried a small remnant of childhood imagination, expecting something imposing, something visibly dangerous, some outward sign that would explain why an entire galaxy had learned to lower its voice at the mention of this species. What I saw instead was 5 people in simple formal attire, walking calmly into the hall with the unremarkable composure of any diplomatic delegation arriving anywhere. A woman near the front, introduced moments later as the lead negotiator, carried herself with practiced professional warmth. Beside her walked a younger man, clearly an aide, carrying a data case and looking slightly nervous, an expression I found strangely comforting in its ordinariness. 2 others followed, engaged quietly in conversation with each other, and behind them all, walking a half-step apart from the group, was a 6th figure. He was older than the others, silver-haired, dressed more plainly than the rest of the delegation, without any of the formal insignia the others wore. He did not walk with any particular ceremony or announcement of importance. If I had passed him in a station corridor without context, I would have assumed he was simply a senior aide, or perhaps a retired official brought along for advisory purposes. And yet, the moment he crossed the threshold into that receiving hall, I felt the entire room shift around me, a change so immediate and so widely shared that it could not have been my imagination alone. Conversations that had continued in low murmurs throughout the hall stopped entirely. Celis Caro's hands, already folded tightly, tightened further still. Halvor Reese, beside me, went completely rigid, and I heard him exhale slowly through his teeth, the sound of a man forcing himself to remain composed through sheer discipline alone. The lead negotiator began the formal introductions, moving efficiently through the delegation's names and titles, and I listened carefully, waiting, though I could not have said exactly what I was waiting for. "And our senior advisor," the lead negotiator said finally, gesturing toward the quiet older man at the rear of the group, "who has offered his counsel to this delegation as a courtesy, given his prior experience along several of the border regions under discussion." She said his name then, simply, without any particular emphasis, the way anyone might introduce a colleague at an ordinary meeting. I had heard that name spoken in fear my entire life. I had heard it whispered by parents to frighten children into obedience, murmured by frightened technicians on an observation deck 2 years earlier, spoken carefully and reluctantly by an Orn diplomat outside a conference room days before, buried in redacted fragments, describing an intervention no record seemed willing to fully explain. Hearing it now, spoken plainly and formally in the middle of an ordinary diplomatic introduction, produced an effect on the room that no amount of preparation could have softened. Halvor Reese's breath caught audibly beside me. Somewhere behind me, I heard a soft, involuntary sound from one of the Orn delegates, something between a gasp and a whispered prayer. Even Corin Bassett, the elderly archivist who had spent 43 years reading fragments of this man's history without ever meeting him, had apparently come to witness the arrival in person, and I saw him grip the edge of a nearby railing as though needing the support. The man himself seemed entirely unaware of, or perhaps simply unbothered by, the effect his name had produced. He offered a small, polite nod toward the assembled delegates, the same courteous gesture anyone might offer upon being introduced to a new group, and said nothing further, allowing the lead negotiator to continue with the remaining formalities. I stood frozen, staring at him, trying to reconcile the ordinary, quiet figure in front of me with everything I had absorbed over the past several days. He did not look dangerous. He did not look imposing. If anything, he looked tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has simply learned to carry it without complaint. The formal introductions concluded, and the assembled delegations began the slow process of moving toward the main conference chamber, where preliminary discussions would begin. I found myself, through some combination of protocol and simple proximity, walking near the human delegation as the crowd shifted and reorganized itself for the transition. The senior advisor glanced toward me briefly as we walked, an ordinary, polite acknowledgement between strangers sharing a corridor, nothing more. And yet in that brief glance, I felt something I had not expected. No menace, no coldness, nothing that matched the terror his name had produced in every version of the story I had grown up hearing. What I saw instead, if I am being entirely honest, was a kind of quiet weariness, and beneath that, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he had seen this exact reaction on countless faces before mine, and had long ago stopped being surprised by it. "Attaché Venn," Halvor said quietly beside me, his voice still not fully steady, "you should prepare yourself. As junior attaché, you will likely be assigned direct liaison duties with several members of the human delegation during the preliminary sessions, including their senior advisor." My chest tightened. "Direct liaison, sir? With him specifically?" "It is standard rotation," Halvor said. "Nothing more. But given what you have clearly already discovered on your own, I imagine the assignment feels considerably less routine to you than it would to someone who had not spent the last several days investigating what the rest of us have spent our entire careers trying not to think about." I did not respond immediately, watching the senior advisor's quiet, unremarkable figure moving ahead of us through the corridor, surrounded by younger colleagues who treated him with obvious deference, despite his plain attire and lack of formal insignia. That evening, following the conclusion of preliminary session protocols, I received formal confirmation of my liaison assignment. I would be responsible for coordinating scheduling and translation support between the Caith delegation and 3 members of the human delegation over the following days, including, as Halvor had predicted, their senior advisor. I stood outside the small meeting room assigned for our first coordination session that evening, my hand hovering near the door control, more nervous than I had been at any point during my entire career, including my very first solo negotiation as a newly certified attaché. I thought of Doran Ash on that observation deck, telling me it only takes one. I thought of Celis Caro's unfinished story about her grandmother. I thought of Corin Bassett's careful, weary theory that the seal on those records existed not to hide cruelty, but to protect an entire galaxy from understanding necessity too well. I opened the door. He was already seated inside, alone, a small data pad open in front of him, reviewing something quietly before I arrived. He looked up as I entered, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly under proper lighting, up close, without the distance of a crowded receiving hall between us. He did not look like a legend. He looked like an ordinary man, tired around the eyes, patient in his posture, entirely unremarkable in every visible way. "Attaché Ven, I assume," he said, his voice calm and unhurried. "I was told you would be coordinating our schedule for the coming sessions." "Yes," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected, though my pulse was anything but calm. "It is an honor to assist your delegation." Something shifted briefly in his expression at that word, honor, a flicker of something I could not immediately identify, gone before I could examine it properly. "You do not need to use words like that with me," he said, not unkindly. "I am simply an advisor doing a job, the same as you." "I do not think that is entirely true," I said, before I could stop myself. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt, for the first time since arriving at Meridian Hold, that I was being truly seen by someone, rather than simply processed as another face in a crowded room. "You have been reading old records," he said finally. It was not a question. "I have," I admitted. "Fragments, mostly. Enough to know that whatever happened along those border regions decades ago, it left a mark on every species who witnessed it, including my own. Enough to know that the fear I grew up with was not built from nothing." He was quiet for a long moment, setting the datapad down carefully on the table between us. "Most people who learn that much choose not to ask further," he said. "It is generally easier not to know." "I would rather know," I said, "than continue being afraid of something I do not understand." He studied me again, longer this time, and something in his tired expression softened slightly, the particular softening of someone deciding, after a very long time, that perhaps one more person deserved the truth after all. "That," he said quietly, "is a braver answer than most people give me. Attaché Ven. Sit down. If you are certain you want to understand what your species has spent generations whispering about in the dark, I will tell you. But I warn you now, before I begin, that understanding it will not make the story smaller. It may, in fact, make it heavier than the fear ever was." I sat down across from him, my hands steady despite everything inside me trembling with anticipation, and I finally, after so many years of dismissing a childhood story as nothing more than superstition, prepared myself to hear the truth. He began, not with the day itself, but with the years leading up to it, and I understood quickly that he was giving me context because he believed, correctly, that the ending would mean nothing without it. 31 years ago, he said, 3 border systems, one belonging in part to your own people, stood on the edge of a conflict that had already consumed 2 decades of smaller skirmishes. A faction had risen from the wreckage of an earlier war, calling themselves the Ash Coil, built from the resentment of a dozen defeated worlds who believed the only path forward was ensuring no one else could ever defeat them again. I have read fragments describing that period, I said quietly. Nothing this detailed. The fragments would not include this, he said, because very few people who survived those final days ever spoke of it clearly enough for anyone to properly record. The ash coil recovered an old weapon from a buried research facility, something built generations earlier by a civilization that no longer exists, designed originally as a deterrent so devastating that its own creators eventually chose to bury it rather than risk its use. The ash coil did not bury it. They activated it and discovered, likely to their own surprise, that it worked exactly as its designers had intended. What did it do? I asked, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. It was designed to collapse the structural integrity of a star system's outer shell in a controlled cascade, he said. Not destruction in the way most conflicts understand it. Erasure. 3 systems, home to civilian populations numbering in the tens of millions, gone within hours of full activation, with no possibility of evacuation once the cascade began. The ash coil intended to use it as a demonstration, to force surrender from every remaining resistance in the region before word of its existence could spread far enough for anyone to organize a proper defense. I felt something cold settle in my chest. How close did they come to using it? Closer than anyone comfortable with peace should ever have to imagine, he said. By the time Allied fleets from several species, including a Kaith border detachment, managed to locate the weapons control vessel, the activation sequence had already begun. Every calculation available to our combined technical staff agreed on one point. There was no way to disable the sequence remotely, no way to destroy the vessel quickly enough without triggering an even faster, uncontrolled version of the same cascade. The only viable path required someone physically aboard that vessel, reconfiguring the activation matrix from within, in the very short window before the sequence became irreversible. You went aboard, I said. It was not a question. I did, he said simply. Not because I was the only person capable of it, technically speaking, but because the ash coil commander aboard that vessel had made it very clear he would execute anyone attempting the reconfiguration the moment they were detected, and every Allied officer with the necessary technical knowledge had a family, a crew, people depending on them surviving that day. I did not have those particular ties at the time, not in the way they did. It seemed in that moment like a simple calculation. I sat very still, absorbing what he was describing, the enormous, quiet weight behind such a plain phrase, a simple calculation. The ash coil commander caught me before I reached the matrix, he continued. There was no way around that. Their security aboard that vessel was thorough, and I was not attempting to hide, only to move quickly enough to reach the controls before I was stopped. When he had me and understood exactly what I intended to do, he offered me a choice. Meant to be cruel, I believe, though I do not think he expected the answer he received. He told me he would allow me to disable the cascade on the condition that I remained aboard the vessel afterward, permanently, as insurance against any future attempt by Allied forces to strike against his remaining fleet. He believed, correctly, that no negotiator sent to save 3 systems would refuse that condition once faced with the alternative. What did you tell him? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I told him I accepted, he said, because at that moment, the specific cost to me personally mattered far less than the tens of millions of lives depending on the cascade never completing. I reconfigured the matrix as agreed. I disabled the sequence with less than 4 minutes remaining before it became irreversible. By every calculation our technical staff had prepared beforehand. And then, because the ash coil commander was not a man who honored agreements he no longer needed to honor, he attempted to ensure I would never leave that vessel in any condition, permanent or otherwise. I realized, sitting there, that I had stopped breathing properly, waiting for the rest. I am not going to describe the details of what followed, he said, and for the first time since he had begun speaking, I saw something genuinely difficult cross his expression, quickly controlled, but present. It is not relevant to why your people learned to whisper my name, and I do not believe reliving it serves either of us. What matters is that I survived that vessel, though not entirely intact, and that the Allied fleet, upon breaching the vessel's defenses roughly 6 hours later, found the Cascade fully disabled and the ash coil command structure aboard that particular vessel no longer capable of continuing the conflict. 6 hours, I said quietly. You were alone with him for 6 hours after disabling the weapon. I was, he said, and offered nothing further on that point, and I understood, from the careful stillness in his voice, that I should not ask him to. The 3 systems survived, he continued instead, his tone shifting back toward something steadier. The ash coil faction, having lost their primary weapon and their command vessel in a single engagement, collapsed within the following months, unable to recover the momentum they had built over the previous years. Peace held along that border for the following 3 decades, largely intact, largely because the specific threat that had driven the conflict no longer existed. That is the intervention, I said quietly. The word, the fragments used, without ever explaining what it meant. That is one of them, he said. There were others, in other regions, over other years, different circumstances, different costs, though the underlying pattern rarely changed. Someone, somewhere, needed to make an impossible calculation quickly enough to matter, and it became, over time, the kind of task people assumed I would accept, given how the first instance had ended. I sat in silence for a long moment, trying to reconcile everything I had absorbed over the past several days with the quiet, tired man sitting across from me, calmly describing decisions that had apparently reshaped the survival of entire star systems as though recounting an ordinary difficult day at work. I do not understand, I said finally, why the story became fear instead of gratitude. What you are describing sounds like courage, not something that deserves to be whispered as a warning to frightened children. He considered that for a long moment before answering. Because gratitude requires understanding what someone did for you, he said, and understanding this particular story requires accepting an uncomfortable truth alongside it. Every species who benefited from that day also had to accept, afterward, that survival had depended entirely on one person's willingness to accept a cost so severe that most people cannot properly imagine it without flinching away from the thought. It is easier, far easier, to convert that discomfort into fear rather than sit with the weight of genuine gratitude for a sacrifice you did not make yourself and hope you would never be asked to make. Fear requires nothing further from you. Gratitude asks you to carry a small portion of the weight alongside the person who carried the rest of it alone. Most people, understandably, choose the lighter burden. I thought of Doran Ash on that observation deck, his voice cracking as he confirmed the sensor reading. I thought of Celis Caro's grandmother, refusing to speak clearly about what she had witnessed even decades later. I thought of every parent across every species who had ever used this man's name to frighten a child into staying close, into obeying, into never wandering too far from safety, without ever explaining that the true lesson buried inside that fear was not a warning about a monster, but an unspoken acknowledgement of a debt too large for most people to properly face. I am sorry, I said quietly, surprising myself with how much I meant it. For every version of that story that turned what you did into something to fear rather than something to properly honor. He offered a small, tired smile, the first genuine warmth I had seen from him since the receiving hall. You do not owe me an apology, Attaché Ven. You were a child repeating a story you were given, the same as every other child across every other species who inherited this particular fear without context. The fault, if there is any to assign, belongs to circumstances too large for any single person to have explained clearly at the time. I am simply glad, after all these years, that someone finally asked the right question instead of accepting the fear without examining it. What happens now? I asked. Between our species, I mean. Between all of us, now that the treaty renewal is finally underway. Now, he said, gathering his datapad and rising slowly from his seat. We continue doing the ordinary, unremarkable work of maintaining peace, the same work that matters far more, in the long stretch of history, than any single dramatic intervention ever could. Fear got your people through the aftermath of that day, HFY. But fear is not a foundation strong enough to build a lasting peace upon. Something closer to what you are feeling right now, understanding, respect, perhaps eventually something resembling trust, tends to hold considerably longer. I walked with him to the door, and as he paused there briefly before stepping into the corridor, I found myself asking one final question, the one that had been sitting quietly beneath everything else since the moment I first heard his name spoken aloud in that receiving hall. "Do you regret it?" I asked. "The choice you made that day, and every choice afterward that followed the same pattern." He considered the question with the same careful seriousness he had given every other part of our conversation, and when he finally answered, his voice carried none of the weariness it had held earlier, only a quiet, settled certainty. "No," he said, "I do not regret saving what could be saved. I regret sometimes what it cost to save it. Those are not the same feeling, HFY, and I have learned, over many years, not to confuse them." He left after that, and I stood alone in the small meeting room for a long while, thinking about the observation deck 2 years earlier, about Doran Ash's tired warning, about an entire galaxy that had spent generations whispering a single name in the dark without ever fully understanding what that name actually represented. They had whispered it in terror, believing it belonged to something to fear. I understood now, standing there in the quiet aftermath of everything I had learned, that they should have been whispering it in gratitude instead. For a man who had walked into the worst possible day imaginable, made an impossible calculation without hesitation, and carried the cost of that calculation quietly, ever since, never once asking anyone else to help him carry it. The treaty renewal proceeded over the following days without further incident. 3 separate delegations working carefully toward an agreement that would hold, hopefully, for another generation. I served as liaison throughout, listening more than I spoke, exactly as Doran had once advised me, and I found, by the time the final signatures were exchanged, that the fear I had carried since childhood had not disappeared entirely, but had transformed into something steadier, something closer to respect for a man who had never once asked to be feared, only to be allowed to do what needed doing. I think of him still, sometimes, when I hear his name whispered elsewhere, among newer generations who have inherited the same story without the same context I was fortunate enough to receive. I no longer correct them harshly when I hear it spoken with fear, because I understand now how difficult it is to carry gratitude for a debt that large. But I tell them, gently, whenever I have the chance, that the man behind that whispered name was never the monster the stories implied. He was simply the last thing standing between an entire region of the galaxy and total annihilation, on a day when no one else was able to stand there instead, and in all the years since, not one person he saved had ever properly found the words to thank him. I hope, in my own small way, that I finally have.